So, Angel, we're both members of the Maryland Tech Council's Technology Inclusivity Initiative. As a preview to the upcoming virtual event, Technology Solutions and Supports to Achieve Your DEI Goals, of which we're both panelists, I thought it might be interesting to give a peek, a preview into some of what we'll be talking about during the event. My work focuses on equality, equity, and evaluation in the supportive services and workforce development space. But for you, without spilling all the beans, can you tell us a little bit about you and what your work focuses on?
So I'm the CEO of the Black Brain Trust. We have a product called EquiScore BI. It's a software platform that essentially turns DEI into an actionable, trackable, industry-specific business metric that, because it can be tracked, it can be improved.
The workforce, the nonprofit workforce industry puts a lot of effort into something that you and I both are familiar with called barrier remediation. We'll be talking more about this at the event, but in workforce development, some obvious barriers to success are transportation and childcare. We hear about that on the news all the time, the cost of childcare. But in Baltimore, when you disaggregate the data and look at the impact on Black women, it gets disheartening quickly. In Baltimore City, Black women comprise 57.8% of the Black workforce. With everything else that could be possibly happening, Black workers have been stymied from reaching their jobs that are located throughout the Baltimore region. As the Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition states, many riders in transit deserts throughout East and West Baltimore, so that is that Black butterfly that you might have heard of, are subject to severe transit detention, being stuck on transit modes for 45 minutes plus in order to get to work or school, including job training programs. How do you, Angel, see the connection between even just this one barrier and achieving DEI goals at the corporate level?
Focusing on DEI is not about just, dealing with diversity and like who's in your workforce and whether or not they feel like they belong. It's also about equity, and equity is really in the results. So when you are prioritizing equity, you're really dealing with sort of what happened before. You're correcting the disadvantages that were perpetuated through sort of historical, racial, or gender exclusion, for example. And you might question, whether or not that is a business owner's job to, sort of focus on that. And my answer would be yes, to the extent that our policies and practices perpetuate those disadvantages, that already exist. So to use your example, let's say that this Black woman who, makes up 57.8% of the workforce in Baltimore, let's say that she overcomes her childcare barriers, her transportation barriers, and she gets into a training program and then overcomes her skills barrier in order to get a job in tech. Obviously, tech those are the jobs of today, those are the jobs of the future. How many Black women work in tech? Focusing on equity would require us to ask that question, to answer that question. How many of them work in our companies? How many of them work in tech, in our city? When it comes to whether or not that woman would get the jobs that we're hiring for, you think about things like, where are companies recruiting from? Are they recruiting from the locations where these Black workers are being trained, whether that's HBCUs or whether that's a training program like the one that you just mentioned? Are they using recruiters? Who's in the network of the recruiters that you're, working with? Does that Black woman have a chance of getting seen by one of those recruiters? Are you using algorithms to screen candidates? What kinds of information is going into those algorithms? Obviously, we've heard a lot already about, how bias can be embedded in the algorithm. So what's in those algorithms that we're using to screen? Whether or not a Black woman in Baltimore is in the job of today, the job of the future is certainly based on multiple factors. Decisions that companies make are certainly a part of that. And I would say that it is certainly the role of a business as a member of the community to understand like who is in your door, what are the numbers of Black women that are in your door, and what are your policies that are allowing that to happen. And then when you look at all the different companies across the city of Baltimore, across the state of Maryland, and if everybody's making those same decisions, how is that impacting whether or not Black women in Baltimore have access to those jobs overall? So that is how a company will play a role in focusing on DEI, both in their doors and in the community that they're a part of. And that's sort of how we measure equity in our process.